So welcome to our colloquium on Sir Walter Scott's journal. We're privileged to have three distinguished contributors speaking today, two former presidents of the club and our honorary secretary. So the format is that we'll hear all three speakers, and after that, there will be an open discussion with an opportunity to raise any questions or comments. I'll briefly introduce each speaker before we hear from them. So we'll begin with an introduction from our Honorary Secretary, David McClay, a familiar figure to us all. David is Head of Development at the British School at Athens. Before taking up that post, he was at the University of Edinburgh Heritage Collections and the National Library of Scotland. David is also a former trustee of Abbotsford, the home of Sir Walter Scott. So let me hand over now to David.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you for those of you who have joined us today. I thought that it would be useful to start off the colloquium today just with a reminder for some of us of the circumstances of Scott's journal, both why it was started, how the physical journal has survived since, how it has been edited and published, and some of the reception. For some of you, this may be familiar territory, but I thought it would be useful as a reminder for us all in any case. So let me start with how Sir Walter Scott started his journal. On the 20th of November 1825, he wrote, "I have all my life regretted that I did not keep a regular journal. I had myself lost recollection of much that was interesting, and I have deprived my family and the public of some curious information by not carrying this resolution into effect." He goes on to mention his recent reading of Lord Byron's unpublished 1821 journal, written in Ravenna, Italy, as a direct inspiration for his starting one. Scott surely would have been delighted in reading Byron's entry for the 12th of January 1821. Scott is certainly the most wonderful writer of the day. His novels are a new literature in themselves, and his poetry as good as any, if not better, only on an erroneous system, and only ceased to be so popular because the vulgar learned were tired of hearing Aristides called the just and Scott the best, and ostracised him. I like him too for his manliness of character, for the extreme pleasantness of his conversation, and his good nature towards myself personally. May he prosper, for he deserves it. I know no reading to which I fall with such alacrity as a work of W. Scott's. Scott had also recently, but doesn't mention in his journal, read the first published edition of Samuel Pepys's diary. His son-in-law, John Gibson Lockhart, had given him an early copy with a request to review it for John Murray's Quarterly Review, for which Lockhart had recently been appointed editor. Lockhart noted that I never observed him more delighted with any book whatsoever, and a positive review article subsequently appeared in March 1826. As well as the influence of Byron and Pepys's journal, the departure of Lockhart and his daughter Sophia to London was a significant loss to Scott, with his only daughter Anne and the children remaining in Abbotsford. Without consultation and companionship, the journal may have provided Scott's losses had only just begun. Scott's wife Charlotte had deteriorating health and would die months later in May 1826, and the personal and national financial crises unfolded over the coming months and remained until his death less than 7 years later. The journal then is an invaluable record of his efforts to pay off his debts, his various writings, his friendships, and his declining health. At the beginning of the journal he wrote, "I am enamoured of my journal. I wish the zeal may last." And it did. He kept it irregularly, throwing aside all pretence to regularity and order, and marking down events just as they occurred to recollection. He continued it between 20th of November 1825 and the 14th of April 1832. That is a span of 2,337 days, or a little under 6.5 years. Physically, it is 2 quarto volumes. The volume height is roughly 23.5 centimetres. Scott described them as, "Behold, I have a handsome locked volume, such as might serve for a lady's album." These were nicely bound in vellum. The 2 manuscript volumes cover 358 and 308 pages. The journal was kept in the family, with his daughter Sophia afterwards transcribing it, and the handwriting is typically Scott. Cramped, not easily to decipher to the unpractised eye, especially as his health deteriorates, where it becomes atrociously difficult, so that a perfectly confident and accurate transcription becomes near impossible. It was clearly an object of affection for the family, it being shown to distinguished visitors to Abbotsford. For example, on a preliminary fly-leaf of Volume 1 are the signatures of Queen Victoria and her children Helena, Louise, and Leopold, dated the 22nd of August 1867. The family, however, sold it around 1900 to the great bibliophile Pierpont Morgan, and in the Morgan Library in New York it remains to this day. Sophia's transcript was the version Lockhart used, as we recently heard from our president, Professor Peter Garside, in the first substantial appearance of Scott's Journal in print, which was in Lockhart's 7-volume Memoirs of the Life of Sir Walter Scott, published 1837 and 38. This was particularly useful in the last 2 volumes, which carried substantial journal extracts. Lockhart described it as the most candid diary that ever man penned. He clearly had not read Byron's diaries and journals, but his general point was well made. Scott, knowing his fame and the interest in his writing, of course foresaw its eventual publication. You may recall my opening quote about the journal being of interest to my family and the public. So he doubtless presented a conscious version of himself, especially in presenting his response to the financial challenges in a flattering light. As biographer John Sutherland has wrote, in these appalling, humiliating circumstances, it evidently became more important than ever that he should preserve a noble image of himself in extremis for posterity. The first substantial edition was edited by David Douglas and published as the Journal of Sir Walter Scott in 1890 in 2 volumes, alongside an American edition. It was reissued the next year, and again in 1910 and 1927, when the text was reworked and the notes expanded by Professor Hume Brown. Afterwards, Thomas Nelson reissued the journal through the 1930s in its affordable classic series. John Guthrie Tate, formerly principal of Central College in Bangalore, objected to the editing of the journal, especially what it had left out, and he produced a slim volume, The Missing Tenth of Sir Walter Scott's Journal, published by Oliver and Boyd in 1936, to draw attention to these omissions. He was then tasked by them to edit a new edition between 1939 and 46. This 3-volume version was produced by collating the Douglas edition against a recently acquired photostat copy of the original manuscript held in the National Library of Scotland. Following Tate's death, the editorial task was completed by one William N. Parker. And of course, the best modern edition was then produced by Eric Anderson and was originally published by Oxford's Clarendon Press in 1972 as an academic work, and then as in a popular paperback editions thereafter, principally from Canongate. Whilst the textual corrections were generally minor, Anderson's edition is amply annotated. It's for these annotations that it stands above the others. Whilst it contains a wealth of information on Scots and other people, Edinburgh and the borders, its one restriction is, according to Anderson, that it is candid about Scott himself, however it is neither informative nor candid about other people. The journal is widely considered one of the finest diaries. On its first fuller publication in 1891, Algernon Swinburne wrote that too long delayed publication of his journal is in every way an almost priceless benefit, but as a final illustration and attestation of a character almost incomparably lovable, admirable, and noble, it is a gift altogether beyond price. Whilst Hesketh Pearson thought it perhaps the most valuable, certainly the most moving, of all his productions, and since it displays a man whose goodness of heart balances greatness of mind, incomparably the most interesting work of its kind ever written. Literary historian Oliver Elton. Whatever else of Scots may lose its colour with time, the journal cannot do so, with its accurate, unexaggerated language of pain. Novelist Hugh Walpole called it the masterpiece of human nature, and Virginia Woolf, Scots journals are the best life of Scott in existence. They contain Scott in his glory and Scott in his gloom. In a few passages, Scott throws more light upon his genius and its limitations than all his critics in their innumerable volumes. I shall close these brief opening remarks with a final quote from John Buchan, who wrote that it is fortunate we possess such a document for the most difficult years of Scott's life. Its biographical work is inestimable, and not less high is its quality as literature. For one thing, it is one of the most complete expressions of a human soul that we possess. There is no reticence and no posturing, because he is speaking to his own soul. Here are qualities which are found only at long intervals in the romances, a tenderness which keeps watch over man's mortality, and neither quails nor complains, a strange wistfulness, as if a strong and self-contained soul had at last found utterance. The greatest figure he ever drew is in the journal, and it is in the man Walter Scott. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. So I'm now delighted to introduce our next speaker and former president of our club, Professor Ali Lumsden. Ali is Regius Chair of English Literature at the University of Aberdeen, where she is General Editor of the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley Novels and the lead editor for an edition of Walter Scott's poetry. She is also Director of the University of Aberdeen's Walter Scott Research Centre, which exists to promote all aspects of research on Scott. She has published extensively on Scott and on other aspects of Scottish literature. Ali is a trustee and honorary librarian of Scott's Library at Abbotsford. Ali is going to speak to us today on A Pleasure Even in Living and Breathing, Nature, Consolation and Well-Being in Scott's Journal. Thank you very much, Ali.
Thank you, Madeleine. I'd just like to thank the club for actually organising this event and David for inviting me to talk today. It's such a fascinating topic for a colloquium because Scott's Journal, as we've just heard, is in many ways considered his masterpiece, and certainly it's one of the most honest and poignant pieces of literature we have from him. We also, as we've just heard, owe a considerable debt to our colleague Eric Anderson for making this valuable edition in such an excellent form, and indeed to Poppy, who helped with that. My topic for today might seem a bit of an unusual approach to the journal, and I just want to say at the outset that I'm not an expert either on the journal or on Scott and the environment. There are many people who have written about the journal, such example, my colleague Ian Alexander took really important work on that. And there are others who are far more expert on eco-criticism, such as Susan Oliver, whose excellent work, Scott and the Greening of Scotland, I would certainly recommend. I'm also indebted here to the work of Dr. Catherine Ferrier, who, while she was a graduate student at Aberdeen, explored the relationship between Scott walking in nature and well-being as part of an event for the Scott 250 celebrations. And I'll say more about that later. However, this week we've been reflecting on Scott, nature and well-being at Abbotsford because we've been enjoying Sheena Stone's wonderful exhibition entitled Enclosed I Will Be Safe, which of course, as this audience knows, is taken from Scott's bookplate motto inspired by an anagram of his own name in Latin. And Sheena's exhibition has offered us a series of textile pieces inspired by the connection Scott makes between trees, nature and well-being. And that's available at Abbotsford until the end of tomorrow, so you've still got a chance to catch that in the gardens. But many of Scott's observations on this topic, on the relationship between nature and well-being, are taken from the journal, and therefore it seemed an appropriate thing to speak about today and just give some consideration to it, particularly, as I'm sure some of you know, we're just at the end of Mental Health Awareness Week. So that's why I chose this topic. So what are the connections between the journal, nature and well-being? Of course, as we all know, Scott is intrinsically linked to the natural world. As a poet and novelist of the Romantic period, his work contains vivid and majestic descriptions of landscape, which inspired many artists and prompted the burgeoning tourist industry in Scotland. I'd also say, though, his more detailed observations of nature are sometimes overlooked. But if we look at something like The Lady of the Lake, we can see that while we have those sublime descriptions of Loch Katrine and the surrounding mountains, we also have detailed descriptions of plants and flowers, such as the eglantine, hawthorn, and hazel, lodged in the fissures of the cliffs. So we have both that wide landscape and the detail. And this love of nature is carried over into his vision for Abbotsford and the ways in which the gardens and the wider landscape of the estate are imagined. Now, in Scott's own time, the most prominent landscape gardener was Capability Brown, who, of course, is famous for remodelling so many of England's great country houses and for creating those open vistas which gave uninterrupted views of grand stately homes. But Scott preferred an aesthetic inspired by writers such as Burke and Uvedale Price. And in his 1824 novel Red Gauntlet, he indicates that his own taste is like that of his character Alan with Hereford, more for wood and wilderness and for a scene of natural grandeur or beauty. And Scott outlines an ideal aesthetic whereby the land immediately around a house may be ornamented in a way that adheres to the architecture of the house, but that as you move out from that, the park should eventually connect themselves with the open countryside by having a bolder, wider and more natural character, and that this should consist of broken ground or copsewood and of growing timber, and that this should imitate a state of wilderness, which makes, as he puts it, the strongest and most pleasing impression on all who are alive to natural beauty. But how can such landscapes be achieved? Scott suggests that you should use three materials: earth, water and trees. And above all, he says, trees remain the proper and most manageable material of picturesque improvement. Now, Scott's emphasis on trees is important because the planting of trees is arguably his most important legacy for the natural landscape of Abbotsford, and it's intrinsically linked to his wider philosophies on the benefits of nature as he describes them in the journal. In the heart of Midlothian, the dying Laird of Dumbydykes gives his son a piece of advice. Jock, when you hae nothing else to do, you may aye be sticking in a tree. It'll be growing, Jock, when you're sleeping. Now, I think we should all take that advice, but certainly Scott took it on board himself when in 1811 he bought the farmhouse of Cartley Hole, which of course was to grow into Abbotsford. And even before he had actually taken possession of the house, he began to plant trees. As he made money from writing poems and writing novels, the once modest farm expanded from 110 acres to over 1,400 acres, and Scott continued to plant trees at an extraordinary rate. At some points, his creative impulses and his planting aesthetics coincide. For example, when he describes that he's acquired a gorge that he was to name Rymer's Glen, Scott claimed that this area of the estate was the place where True Thomas had met the Queen of Faery, an event described, of course, in Thomas the Rhymer. And in a letter to Joanna Baillie of 1818, he expresses excitement about having added this land to his own. And the description he gives seems to come straight out of his own poetry. I have a little wildwood glen, which I should delight to show you. It is a mere chasm with a streamlet trickling through it, but it is so well diversified with bushes, trees, and small cascade that it's quite a witch's dell. Moreover, I must tell you that the friend who assists me as overseer of my farm, who is a person of various attainments, and an especial good botanist, found the mistletoe in it in winter, and within these 2 days the enchanter's nightshade, which gave us great pleasure, as the place is called the Rymer's Glen, after Thomas the Rhymer, who met the Queen of the Fairies either there or somewhere else. Is it not a quiet and peaceable life, when such things as these are matters of importance and the gravest occurrences of our 24 hours? I like that phrase, that True Thomas met are either there or somewhere else. But it was indeed Scott's enthusiasm for making landscapes and planting trees that was perhaps recognised as his greatest legacy, because he knew that these might far outlast his own literary endeavours. And he writes to Countess Pugstill in 1821, "My oaks will outlast my laurels," adding in jokey fashion, "and I pique myself more on my compositions for manure than on any other compositions whatsoever to which I was accessory." And Scott's not just being flippant here. In the same letter, he describes having a deep experience as a planter and a landscape gardener. And indeed, he did acquire a great knowledge of tree planting and pruning trees I could work at from morning to night, he says to Joanna Baillie. And it's interesting to note the number of books on tree planting he has in the library at Abbotsford. And of course, he reviewed Robert Monteith's The Forester's Guide and Profitable Planter, and also other works such as Sir Henry Stewart's book on transplanting trees, again showing his vast knowledge of this area. But one of the most detailed accounts of Scott's tree planting activities we have comes in a journal that's less well known than the one we're speaking about today, Scott's tree planting journal, which is called Silva Abbotsfordiensis, which is a manuscript held at Abbotsford and was transcribed by for the Faculty of Advocates Abbotsford Collection Trust by myself and Professor Gerard Crothers at Glasgow. That's available on the Advocates website if you want to look at it. Now, Scott indicates that this journal is intended as a vehicle for recording all the facts and experiences concerning the management of wood on the Abbotsford estate. And it begins on the 1st of January 1819, and it's clear that it was his intention to supplement it each year as conditions changed. To this purpose, Scott divides it into sections according to the areas of the Abbotsford estate, leaving space to update each of these on a yearly basis. He records what's been planted, how it has fared, or in some cases failed, because some things do fail, what he learns from that experience, and indeed how his vision for what this will achieve in the longer term will be, even when he knows he will never see these views himself. He laments no artist in this field could hope to see the perfection of his own labours, except if they live long or commence their labours early in life. And I'll just give you a brief extract from Silva to give you a sense of the kind of detail he provides, the care which he's taking over planting, and the ways in which he's applying the information he's gleaned from the books he's read to his own activities. Here he's describing the work he's done on the waterside Underhoch. March 1824, I removed the trees prepared on Sir Henry's plan, that's Sir Henry Stewart, that is having their roots cut round a year before, and lifting on the expiry of that period, divesting their roots of all the earth which adheres to them, and carefully of now incorporating them with the soil in which they're planted by laying them out regularly and kneading the earth in by handfuls, observing that the centre or trunk of the tree should be kept highest in the ground and all the roots made to tend downwards to the extremity of the circle. So you can see really detailed information here. Now, the last entries for Silva, poignantly, are in 1825, just before Scott was to lose all his money in the financial crash, which of course put a stop to his planting of trees. And so it ends just before the journal that we're considering today begins. So how do these activities and philosophies relate to that more famous journal and to the theme of well-being that I'm considering today? While we recognise Scott's mental health struggles in his later life through the pages of the journal, we might forget that throughout his life, Scott suffered from periods of low spirit and depression, what he refers to in the journal as mullygrubs. So in 14th March 1826, as for myself, while I had scarce stirred to take exercise for 4 or 5 days, no wonder I had the mullygrubs. It is an awful sensation, though, and would have made an enthusiast of me had I indulged my imagination on devotional subjects. I've always been careful to place my mind in the most tranquil posture which it can assume during my private exercises of devotion. However, as the journal goes on, it offers a record of how these episodes were to become more acute after the financial crash of 1825 and the death of Charlotte. While Scott struggled on valiantly to pay off his debts and those of his publishers, he offers a poignant and candid record of his lowness of spirits. However, we should note in the section of the journal that I just quoted, Scott attributes the particular attack of the mullygrubs to the fact that he had scarce started to take exercise for 4 or 5 days. And indeed, in the journal, Scott repeatedly notes that it's through walking and engaging with nature that he can fight with the fiend of depression. For example, Scott recounts how walking in nature helps relieve the anxiety he feels during his wife's terminal illness, reporting on 1st May 1826 that while his cousin is shocked by the melancholy change in Lady Scott, he consoles himself by walking to the western corner of the Chief's Wood plantation, making plans for planting more trees. On the 5th, he's haunted by gloomy thoughts, but his old friend Sir Adam Ferguson called and took a long walk with me, which was charity. On the 7th, he writes until his backbone ached, but adds, I believe it was a nervous affection, for a walk cured it. Lady Scott dies on 15th May 1826, and on the 24th, 2 days after the funeral, Scott reports, slept wretchedly, or rather waked wretchedly all night, and was very sick and bilious in consequence, and scarce able to hold up my head with pain. A walk, however, with my sons did me a good deal of good. Indeed, throughout the journal, Scott reports the ways in which engagement with nature helps restore his spirits. On 18th July 1827, Scott notes that his nerves have been bad, but reminds himself that he will benefit from exercise and from engagement with nature. The summer breeze brings the tears into my eyes not unpleasingly, but I must exercise and case harden myself. There is no use in encouraging these moods of the mind. It is not the law we live on. An entry for 19th July again records the benefits of walking in his beloved estate. Walked through the glens till dinner time. I have written well, walked well, talked well, and have nothing to regret. Now, I don't think it's simply a romantic communing with nature that Scott's advocating here, but a more overt engagement with his beloved trees. As in the journal, he describes walking to Chief's Wood, the glens of Huntley Barn and the lake. He is, of course, mapping out the ground he has described in Silva, and where he has spent the years between 1811 and 1825 planting trees. In April 1826, for example, he notes that he's walking home by one of the 101 paths he had made through the woods he himself had planted. And when Scott is not at Abbotsford, but compelled to be in Edinburgh for court duties, the journal also records the ways in which he seeks out green spaces. On 3rd July 1828, it occurs to him that he has a key to Princes Street Gardens, and he notes, wherefore should I walk along the broiling and stifling streets when I have a little key in my bosom that can open any lock in Princes Street walks, and be thus on the castle banks, rocks and trees in a few minutes? It's equally clear that even this walking in the city has done him good. I made use of my key accordingly, he writes, and walked from the Castle Hill down to Wallace's Tower, and thence to the west end of Princes Street, through a scene of grandeur and beauty, perhaps unequalled, whether in the foreground or the distant view is considered. All downhill too, foolish never to have thought of this before. I chatted with the girls a good while after dinner, but wrote a trifle when we had tea. So you can see that this walk has done him good in Princes Street Gardens. Now, it's only very recently that we've fully come to recognise the benefits that can be gained from walking among trees. And Scott, of course, couldn't have known the scientific evidence that now underpins the relationship between walking in trees and well-being. Think of things like forest bathing, for example. But he seems to have had an intuitive sense of this and a curiosity about it too. In August 1827, for example, he observes after a walk to Rymer's Glen that while he's well aware that exercise should restore the nerves from the chill of numbness, which is allied to palsy, he is more curious about how he should restore elasticity to sinews that are too much relaxed. So he's thinking through, he recognises this does him good, but he's also thinking through why. Now, Scott's journal is a compelling but a difficult read, recording, as we've heard, his adversity in later years. But we should also recognise that it's a document about resilience and recovery. Towards its close, we do see signs of rejuvenation in Scott as he gradually recovers from the twin shocks of his financial losses and his wife's death. And this recovery, interestingly, is captured in his response to nature and the presence of trees. The freshness of the air, the singing of the birds, the beautiful aspect of nature, the size of the venerable trees, all gave me a delightful feeling this morning, he writes in May 1828. It seemed there was a pleasure even in living and breathing without anything else. And Scott, too, expresses this recovery by comparing himself to his beloved trees. Writing in June 1829, he notes, I too, old trunk as I am, have put out tender buds of hope, which seem checked forever. At the opening of his journal, Scott recognises that his failure to keep a regular diary means I have myself lost recollection of much that was interesting, and I have deprived my family and the public of some curious information by not carrying this resolution into effect. In Silva, Scott also expresses a hope that it might be of interest to those whose lot it may be to walk under the shade of the trees which I am now engaged in planting. In both cases, Scott is recognising that the act of journaling provides a means of talking to the future, of continuing a conversation with those who come after us. As he does so often in his poems and novels, Scott is reminding us that the past and present can be in dialogue, whether it be through a natural landscape or, as in the journal, when rather than being shaped and organised by the writer, he throws aside all pretense to regularity and order and marks down events just as they occurred to recollection. Scott's work constantly reminds us that this dialogue is possible because the concerns and interests of the past are always recurring, if reimagined for different times. The foundational concept of all this work, I would suggest, that we have here. Critics like Susan Oliver have indeed suggested that so forward-looking are Scott's ideas in ecology and well-being that he emerges as an authorial precursor of 21st century environmentalism. It's no surprise then that people have taken the ideas that Scott expresses in his journal on walking, landscape and well-being and explored their perhaps surprising resonance for our own times. For example, as I mentioned earlier, in 2021, Kate Ferrier teamed up with the charity Hillgoers to take a group of people into the Cairngorms near Mar Lodge, where they reflected on Scott's exploration of walking, nature and well-being in the journal. The event prompted the mental health charity Black Dog Outdoors. It promoted that charity, and all who participated suggested that they made them consider both Scott and the connections between mental health and well-being in new ways. Sheena Stone's current exhibition at Abbotsford highlights the importance of the natural landscape that Scott created and what it meant to him in relation to his own creativity and well-being, interpreting this again in innovative ways, with many pieces inspired by quotes from the journal. These events offer new opportunities to enter into a creative conversation with Scott and the threads he draws so poignantly and so beautifully in the journal between mental health, walking and the natural world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ali. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, also a former president of our club, Lord Stewart, Angus Stewart. So Angus is a retired Court of Session and High Court judge. He practised as an advocate before his appointment as a judge. He served as keeper of the Advocates' Library from 1995 until 2002. And in that role, he was the inaugural chair of the Faculty of Advocates Abbotsford Library project. Angus's topic today is "I would fight knee-deep in blood ere it came to that." Does this journal entry for 9th of June 1826 give a clue as to why Scott changed the setting of the Bride of Lammermoor from before to after the union of Scotland with England? So I'll now hand over to Angus. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got a bit of a crisis here. Never appear with children, animals, or IT. Something is running out of charge. But anyway, this contribution raises a question, as Madeleine mentioned, about a journal entry of the 9th of June, 1826. And the question is, does the entry give a clue as to why Scott changed the setting of the Bride of Lammermoor from before to after the union, less veiled on contemporary events? It can be both, of course. In the case of Sir Walter Scott, I suggest we can be reasonably satisfied that certain passages in his fiction reflect preoccupations of the author's own day. The passages I have in mind on today's occasion are in The Bride of Lammermoor, not the original text of 1819, but the revised Magnum edition text of 1830. There is a clue, an unmistakable clue, I suggest, once we know the background, in the journal entry of 9th of June, 1826. Here is the journal entry, quote, "One effect of running cases fast through the courts below is that they go by scores to appeal, and Lord Gifford, that's Gifford spelt Gifford, not Gifford as we should say it, an Englishman, Lord Chief Justice and then Master of the Rolls, the first Baron Gifford, who in the Lord Chancellor's absence chaired the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords." My father warned me, by the way, never to trust a man who can't pronounce his own name. Anyway, going back to Lord Gifford, cases go by scores to appeal, and Lord Gifford has hitherto decided them with so much rapidity as to give great satisfaction. The consequence will in time be that the Scottish Supreme Court, that's the inner house of the Court of Session, will be in effect situated in London. Then down fall as national objects of respect and veneration the Scottish bench, the Scottish bar, the Scottish law herself, and there is the end of an old sang, where I, as I have been, I would fight knee-deep in blood ere it came to that. But it is a catastrophe which the great course of events brings daily nearer. That is the journal entry. Now, I'm sure, Madam Chair, the reference is familiar, the end of an old song, words spoken by Scotland's Lord Chancellor Seafield on the sealing of the union with England. The independence of the Scottish courts and Scots law was meant to be preserved by the Act of Union, But Scott's journal entry foresees the disappearance of that legal vestige of Scotland's nationhood. So what prompted the journal outburst? I have to mention two preliminaries. First, I acknowledge the inspiration I've derived from Eric Anderson's edition of the journal, of course, from Ian Gordon-Brown, he's with us today, from Professors John Cairns, Jane Milgate, and Peter Garside, Peter being this year's club president. Secondly, in what follows, I have sometimes, by omitting wordage superfluous to my purpose, compressed or paraphrased quotations from Scott's writing. So, to begin at the beginning, The Bride of Lammermoor tells of the tragic love affair between the dispossessed royalist, Edgar, Master of Ravenswood, and Lucy, daughter of the Arrivist lawyer politician, the Lord Keeper, Sir William Ashton, a Low Church man. The castle and lands of Ravenswood have, by questionable means, in Scotland's Court of Session, been forfeited to the Lord Keeper. The original 1819 text of the Bride places the action before the Act of Union of 1707. The text of the Magnum edition of 1830 puts the action afterwards. The alteration means that Ravenswood's threatened legal challenge to Ashwood's dubious appropriation of the Ravenswood estate, a, quote, protestation, as it was called to the Scottish Parliament, for, quote, remede of law, becomes, after 1707, a threatened appeal to the British House of Peers, in other words, the House of Lords. The change is illustrated in the interleaved version, a binding with blank pages for manuscript changes, which shows Scott's abrupt manuscript emendations of the previously printed text. On screen now, I hope, for you. Can we see this page from the interleaved version?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. The passage that I previously read, quote, if the Scottish Parliament should be disposed, let's look at the next bit. If the Scottish Parliament should be disposed to act upon the protestation of the Master of Ravenswood for remede of law, has been revised to read. Part of the emendation is on the facing page that we saw, has been revised to read, if the English House of Lords should be disposed to act on an appeal from the Master of Ravenswood. Now, this redating allows Lord Keeper Ashton's circle to allows Scott to use the fictional anxieties of Lord Keeper Ashton's circle as a vehicle for actual concerns about appeals to the House of Lords in the novelist's own day. In the Magnum edition, Scott suggests that the earlier text did not sufficiently bring out the contrast between the black letter justice of the Court of Session and parliamentary equity. The contrast and the dramatic effect are heightened by moving the appeal to a distant forum, the House of Lords in London, which, insofar as conversant with the law of Scotland, is possibly contemptuous of it, and where the outcome is beyond the Lord Keeper's provincial influence. And there is an added dimension, already alluded to, the threat to Scotland's national identity as manifested in the separate legal system. Now, a critical difference between protestations for remede and appeals is that the former did not automatically suspend enforcement of the court judgment complained of, while the latter did for a century from and after the Greenshields case in 1711. The situation is shown graphically on the screen. As a result, appeals to the Lords multiplied by 1806. 1806 is here. Wait a moment. Scotland at that point is the top line on this chart, or Scotch appeals. By 1806, the situation had reached crisis point, not at that stage for the substantive law of Scotland. Decisions of the House of Lords were generally ignored north of the border as substantive law precedents, but for the administration of British justice, 4 out of 5 Lords' appeals came from Scotland, and there were 200 Scotch appeals in the backlog. There followed more than 20 years of initiatives to curtail appeals from the session to London. In the century after the Union, the impact of decisions by the House of Lords on the substance of Scots law was negligible. Law reporting is how knowledge of case law precedent is disseminated, and incredibly, there was no published collection of Scotch, as they were called, appeal reports until 100 years after the Union. That arrived in David Robertson's reports of cases on appeal from Scotland, decided in the House of Peers, from the Union in 1707 to the commencement of the reign of George II, and that was in 1727. So a very partial reporting at that stage of House of Lords decisions. The preface to Robertson's reports implies that decisions of the Court of Session, which had been reversed in London, continued to be regarded by Scots jurists as authoritative in point of law. But all that was about to change. Scott had been gazetted Joint Principal Clerk of Session in Dalrymple's office on the 8th of March 1806, so not a lawyer politician in the Sir William Ashton mould, but nonetheless during the initial phase of reform, in the first rank of the supporting cast as a functionary and as a polemicist. The Faculty of Advocates meetings of 1807, a leading opponent of Lord Grenville's Court Reform Bill, that was a Whig bill, probably responsible too for getting the anti-bill speeches published. Secretary of the Judge's delegation to the House of Lords during the Court of Session spring recess in 1807, clerk to the Royal Commission for Inquiring into the Administration of Justice in Scotland, established under Lord Chancellor Eldon's watered-down Tory Judicature Act of 1808, clerking the Commissioners' meetings in Edinburgh and London through 1809 and 1810, the author of the anonymous article View of the Changes Proposed and Adopted in the Administration of Justice in Scotland, in his own Edinburgh Review, published in 1810. Scott is revealed as someone with a serious interest, both philosophical and pragmatic, in the workings of the law and the ways it shapes and is shaped by society. The immediate relevance of the 1810 article, an excerpt of which is now on screen, is Scott's repetition of the critique which he had first offered in 1807, namely that the remedy for the perceived mischief of too many Scotch appeals lay with the House of Lords and not in changes to the Court of Session. And so it proved from the 1820s, with progressive professionalisation of appellate business in the Lords, taking the business into the hands of legally qualified peers. The landmark reforms of the Court of Session, introduced by the respectful and lenient hand of the Tory Lord Chancellor Eldon from 1808, did not apparently cause Scott anxiety for the future of the substance of Scots law. These reforms were structural. They divided the 15-judge Court of Session, Scotland's Supreme Court, into two divisions. The first division of the Inner House, chaired by the Lord President, and the second division of the Inner House, chaired by the Lord Justice Clerk. A subsequent phase of reform, which focused on procedures, was different. It saw Scott fulminating from the sidelines about, quote, the interference of these Englishmen with their periwigs and their parchment bags. That was in 1823, when the Royal Commission on the Form of Process, i.e. court procedure, and the course of appeals to the House of Lords was set up. At the same time, another historical romance was in preparation by Scott, the novel to be published in the following year as Red Gauntlet in 1824, which, no coincidence, I suggest, the dyed-in-the-wool Jacobite Hugh Red Gauntlet mocks as, quote, mongrel things, those Scottish advocates who, quote, must creep to learn the ultimate decision of their causes to the bar of a foreign court, instead of pleading before the independent and august parliament of their own native kingdom, close quotes. Mark the words, foreign court. The Royal Commission's proposals were put into effect by the Judicature Act of 1825 with related rules of court, and poor Sir Walter officiated at the Saturday sitting of the full court, both divisions sitting together, on 12th November 1825, when the new rules, for which he had no taste, were appointed by the Lord President to be inscribed by him in the books of Sederunt. Scott sounded the alarm at the beginning of 1826 in the pseudonymous letters of Malachi Malacrowther. The polemic was published in defence of the right of Scotch banks to issue their own currency, but Scott illustrated his argument with reference to what was already happening in the legal sphere. He deprecated the error of judging another country's laws without being aware of the whole context, and he wrote, it would be no reason for planting, here we come back to trees again, we no reason for planting mulberry trees in Scotland that they luxuriate in the south of England. Of the recent procedural reforms, he wrote in these pamphlets, I beg, therefore, to be considered as not speaking of the alterations themselves, but of the apparent hostility towards our municipal meaning national, our municipal institutions as repeatedly manifested in the course of late proceedings, tending to force and wrench them into a similarity with those of England. What I do complain of is the general spirit of slight and dislike manifested to our national establishments by those of the sister country, close quotes. And Scott complained also of the, quote, jealousy of, quote, hasty and imperfectly informed English judges who have, quote, shown themselves so anxious to revolutionise the Scottish legal system. And I think it's quite possible that in writing this, our author had in mind Lord Gifford, now on screen. One particular litigation conducted under the new dispensation and clerked by Scott in the Inner House, in the first division of the Inner House, was for Scott the most disturbing portent of things to come. It took less than a year under the new procedures for the cause in question to go through the first instance in the Inner House and the appeal to the first division of the first instance in the Outer House and the appeal to the first division of the Inner House, and to reach final determination in the Lords at London. The Lords declined to affirm the decision of the to consult with the second division judges as to whether the English rule, the equitable English rule in the case of Sitwell and Bernard, should become part of Scots law. The first division, let it be said, had already determined unanimously that, quote, to apply the English doctrine would be setting up a principle of equity against the intention of the testator, namely the person who had written the will. The decision of the Lords was pronounced on the 26th of May, 1826. Within a week, the news was in Edinburgh, and then Scott made the entry in his journal about the forthcoming catastrophe for the law of Scotland. I think it's worth reminding ourselves of something already been mentioned, that at this point in time, Scott was grieving for the death of his wife. Before I answer the question posed at the outset, let me mention a curious thread running through Scott's fictional tale of Ravenswood and Ashton. The thread is the Dalrymple family. The origin of the bride's story was a real-life tragedy in the Dalrymple family in 1669. The Whiggish Sir James Dalrymple became president of the Court of Session and was ennobled as Viscount Stair. The character of Sir William Ashton, the bride's father in the novel, is said to have been based, though Scott denied it, at least in part, on the character of Viscount Stair. Quote, brilliant pliability in an age of trimming. The Lord President's son was made the Earl of Stair, and it was the judgment of the House of Lords in the case, John Dalrymple, 7th Earl of Stair, against trustees John Dalrymple, 6th Earl of Stair, that provoked the journal outburst. When Scott came to review the Lammermoor text for the Magnum edition, he was bound to have had in mind the recent Earl of Stair appeal to the House of Lords. Indeed, in the very first sentence of the Magnum introduction, Scott alludes to the 7th Earl, John William Henry Dalrymple, who succeeded to the earldom on the death of his cousin in 1821. I don't want to put it too strongly, but let me ask this question. Is it possible that Scott felt a sort of sense of betrayal? In the 1819 edition, Scott had concealed the origin of the Lammermoor story out of sensitivity for this John William Henry Dalrymple and his scandalous matrimonial difficulties. And yet here was the same man, now an Earl of Stair, pressing on with his appeals to the House of Lords, to the detriment of Scots law, as it were, when he could well afford to compromise. Let's just have a picture of Scott at this point in time. This is a a portrait of Scott sitting as Clerk of Court in 1829. I believe the chair he's sitting on is the chair which is still in the possession of the Faculty of Advocates. And this was at the time when the Magnum edition of the Bride was in preparation. As Scott feared, things did get worse. In the Stair litigation, the judges of the First Division duly consulted their brethren, the judges of the Second Division, and sent back exactly the same answer to the House of Lords, who would have none of it, and directed their lordships in Edinburgh to apply the law of England. That was in June 1827, and the forward policy of the House of Lords on Scotch appeals continued. And so Scott came to change the historical setting of the Bride of Lammermoor. The 1830 edition has the following description of the attitude of the Ashton Circle to an appeal to the House of Lords. Quote, a degradation of Scotland, the decisions of whose learned judges are thus subjected to the review of a court composed indeed of men who might be supposed specially to hold in contempt the law of Scotland, and thus added to Ashton's anxiety about his personal fortunes was a professed anxiety about what would happen to the law of Scotland. Quote, if the law of Scotland as declared in her Supreme Courts were to undergo a reversal in the House of Lords, the evils which would thence arise to the public would inflict a greater wound upon his, i.e. Lord Keeper Ashton's, would inflict a greater wound upon his heart than any loss he might himself sustain. Close quotes. He, Lord Keeper Ashton, unlike, let me interject, the 7th Earl of Stair, would be prepared to compromise the dispute rather than that, quote, the law of Scotland should sustain a severe wound in the case of the barony of Ravenswood through the intervention of what Ashton said he must term a foreign court of appeal. There we have it again, phrase, foreign court. So back to the question posed in the title. Does the journal entry of the 9th of June 1826 give a clue as to why Scott changed the setting of the Bride of Lammermoor from before to after the union of Scotland with England? And the answer, I suggest, Madam Chair, is yes. So the rules of court became a novel, and the novel became a libretto, and the libretto was set to music by Donizetti. In the opera, of course, Lucia di Lammermoor, and from that we have the glory of Maria Callas. Here she is singing at the Met in 1956, the finale of the first act of Lucia di Lammermoor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Angus. So that concludes the presentations from our three speakers, and the floor is now open for any questions or comments. I think if you're able to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, Lee can then unmute you. Thanks.
Ian always makes a comment. Ask the question.
No, it doesn't look as if we can tempt any of our audience to offer any questions.
Could I ask whether the various things that Angus mentioned that led to the text being changed, whether they were things that people in general in Edinburgh or Scotland would know about, or were they really rather just people who are connected with the law would have been aware of? Were they matters of contention on a wider scheme?
Why on air? I can't answer that question. What I can say is that within the legal profession, certainly, there was a knowledge of what change had been made in 1707, and an understanding that Scots law really hadn't been innovated upon by the House of Lords for 100 years after the Union. I would have to go into the matter much more deeply to find out whether popular sentiment was disturbed by these developments. It has been a matter of comment since Scott's time. And I think the high watermark of the imposition of English ideas in the legal sphere came in 1854 with a case called the Barton's Hill Coal Company case, where I think it was Lord Justice Chelmsford said something like, if this be the law of England, is there any reason for thinking it should not also be the law of Scotland? But no, I can't answer your question directly, Alan.
Thank you.
Yes, it doesn't look as if we've any other questions or comments. I was just going to comment, Ali, that it looks, you mentioned, that we're just at the end of Mental Health Awareness Week, and I think there's quite a lot in the public field these days, letting us know that walks in nature and getting into nature can be a great benefit to mental health issues. So Scott really seems to be quite ahead of his time in identifying that.
Yes, that's what's interesting is that, now that seems almost commonplace. But to find Scott writing about that so much in the journal and recognising that, and recognising that it's not just walking, it's walking in nature. And for Scott particularly among trees, I think that can do you good. And it's really nice to see Scott sort of anticipating that. It's just another sense in which we can see Scott being ahead of his time, which is good.
Thanks. Well, yes, I think in the absence of any other questions, we shall conclude our colloquium. And may I just thank all three of our speakers for very different contributions, different topics, but all extremely interesting and fascinating. And let me now just advertise our next club lecture, which will take place on